1937 Ohio River floods. In 1937, the Ohio River experienced one of its worst floods in history. Heavy rain fell for weeks, causing the river to swell beyond its banks. Towns along the river, like Cincinnati and Louisville, were overwhelmed. Residents watched as their homes and businesses were destroyed. Local communities came together to help those affected, and volunteers provided food, shelter, and clothes to families displaced by the rising waters. The government also stepped in, building levees and improving flood management to prevent such disasters for the future. The flood taught many valuable lessons about preparedness and community support, showing that even in the face of nature's fury, people could come together to help each other rebuild.
Weather patterns, causes, heavy rain, 5 to 10 inches fell in January through February, saturated soil, previous storms left ground unable to absorb more water, storm systems, a low pressure system brought persistent rain from the Gulf of Mexico, river characteristics, banks overflowed and ice jams worsened flooding. The impact, displacement, over 300,000 people lost their homes, economic hardships with businesses and farms being severely affected, and vulnerable communities, low-income areas face the worst of these impacts.
Okay, so some of the magnitude of the flooding, this flooding covered over 200,000 square miles of land and nearly all the state of Kentucky, as well as Ohio and Indiana. It brought almost a foot of rain in 18 days from January to February of 1937. An estimated 165 billion tons of water fell into the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and the floodwaters rose over 80 feet in some locations, like Cincinnati and Ohio. Major floods in the Ohio River Basin are infrequent, however. One with the equivalent magnitude of this flooding happens approximately once every few decades, so it's not very common. And the magnitude changes as climate changes, leading to increased precipitation and more extreme weather events such as this flooding. Things that cause it, such as climate changes, may increase the frequency and severity of flooding events in the area. And some anthropogenic factors that have affected the frequency or can affect the frequency and magnitude of flooding include urbanization, deforestation, and global warming.
So the societal and economic impacts. So the Ohio River floods were devastating to many communities in the Ohio River Valley. This flood led to 385 people to die and over 1 million were left homeless. The property damage would reach 500 million, and adjusted for inflation in 2022, came up to about $10 billion. So the flood lasted from mid-January to early February, which greatly affected day-to-day life, which would impact businesses, roads to close, and prevented a lot of products and goods to come into the area and resources. And during this time period, there wasn't a lot of technology that could provide help for many living in these communities. So these road closures provided or caused a lot of resources to not be available. Um, Farmland along the Ohio River was also heavily affected as many crops and soil was eroded. Floods destroyed a lot of infrastructure like roads. Like I said earlier, this halted transportation of a lot of goods and services. And the flood also overwhelmed the sewage system, which would cause sewage to mix with floodwaters, leading to widespread contamination.
Last, we got adaptation strategies. We got flood control devices, which were dams and levees built to contain flood waters to reduce flooding risk along the Ohio River. And then we have flood walls and gates and diversion channels. And then we're going into our next one, which is land use regulations and zoning. We got floodplain zoning, which is restrictions on new construction in flood prone areas. And we have elevated buildings. New construction is required to be elevated above expected flood levels. And then we have existing structures, older buildings to be more flood resistant. And then we have community retreat and abandonment. We have floodplain evacuation, which is certain floodplain areas abandoned or relocated to reduce long-term risks. Then we have resettlement and relocation, which is incentives provided for families to move out of the high-risk flood zones. And last, we have regular flooding and planning, which is flood preparedness and evacuation plans, was development of organized flood response strategies. And then we have flood insurance and assistance, which is federal and local efforts to establish food insurance programs and financial aid for homeowners. Then we have flood monitoring labs, with enhanced monitoring of river levels and weather conditions for early floodings warnings. And that's our sources.